I'd like to welcome our three speakers, Bernadette, Donald and Sean. Thank them very much for coming, and we're really looking forward to their presentations. Just a brief few introductory words. I suppose we've heard some very good presentations this morning. Lots more to come now, and some more this afternoon. And I suppose I'm with TASC on the board of TASC in a voluntary capacity. And basically, I suppose where we're coming from on TASC is that, there's a very good level of debate out there on terms of cuts and, tax increases and all that type of stuff. But there's very little debate on the alternatives that we're talking about in this conference. But, we can have endless debate basically, but where we want to get to in TASC as rapidly as possible is we want to get specific recommendations that we can try to promote through the public thinking, get discussion on it, and get the policy makers to try to tune in to the alternative approaches in terms of that cuts aren't going to work, that we have to get into a position that the economy can be boosted and that we can grow the jobs. So an increased tax take, reduce spend on unemployment and all the rest of it. So I suppose what we'd like to see coming out of this event, this particular session, is we get three very good presentations that take 5 or 8 minutes each, a discussion from the floor, and I'd like at the end of the presentation if we could wrap up then by coming up with some specific recommendations or points that we can work on afterwards, be it 2, 5, 6 points or whatever we come up with. But that we have a specific output that we can take lessons from and work on those afterwards. So with those few words, I'd like to hand over to our first speaker, then. Donald, you're scheduled first. So you can probably introduce yourself much better than I can. So just say a few words.
My name is Donald Kotzak. I'm in the Department of Economics at the University of Limerick. And my main area of research for the last few years has been on the privatisation of commercial state-owned enterprises in Ireland. So that's really the standpoint I'm going to be coming from today. In terms of the question we were really asked to look at was what role, I suppose, public enterprise can play in the future recovery, and also in the context of the recent review group on state assets that was announced there recently. So just to frame what I wanted to really talk about today, I'll talk about what the Irish experience with privatisation has been so far, and then what I think the policy should really be, especially the recommendations that come out of the review group. And just for some of you who might know, the terms of reference of the review group included to consider the potential for asset disposals in the public sector, including commercial state bodies, in view of the indebtedness of the state. So the key words that I picked up from that anyway were, most people did, were there was a bit of a panic that there might be a fire sale of assets because of that phrase, the indebtedness of the state, and examining which assets we might be able to sell. But they also had one of their terms of reference was to assess how the use and disposition of such assets can actually generate and contribute to national investment priorities. So the first 2 or 3 minutes of what I want to say, I'll just talk about what the Irish experience with privatisation has been so far and the lessons that can be drawn from that for policymakers, and then to also examine what is the potential role that our existing state assets can actually play in any future economic recovery. So just to start, in relation to any potential privatisation of a commercial state-owned enterprise, so the likes of the ESB, Bord Gáis, etc. And whenever one questions, brings up the issue of privatisation, it's often in the context that privatisation will lead to improved performance, and this will obviously improve the wider efficiency of the greater economy. It's often rolled out as a key objective of privatisation, and it's particularly important in the case of state-owned enterprises that operate in strategic, key network, usually the utility sectors of the economy. Just broadly speaking, the theoretical and empirical literature internationally and nationally, have pointed to very mixed conclusions in terms of there's no unequivocal case in favour of privatisation. In some cases it works, in other cases it doesn't. And more often than not, they generally point to other factors that can be as important as changes in ownership in terms of the performance of privatised companies. So my own research, along with my colleague Dr. Henri's in the University of Limerick, we've analysed the impact of privatisation on the performance of the 10 privatised SOEs that we've had to date. Since 1991, there have been 10 companies privatised, and our findings are generally consistent with the international literature. In almost every case, there was a significant or considerable improvement in company performance prior to privatisation. However, post-privatisation performance in general has been far less impressive. So there's little evidence from the Irish case to support the fundamental hypothesis that a change to private ownership will actually lead to an improvement in performance. But again, ownership is one of just a complex set of factors that really impact on company performance. Other important factors are really factors such as the market structure, competition, institutional factors such as the regulatory framework, and factors internal to each organisation such as their management, their structures, their governance, etc. They're all as important, if not more important, than the whole question of ownership in determining the performance of those companies. So privatisation is really unlikely to yield significant improvements in performance unless there are changes to the firm's internal and external environments. I suppose the most important companies that we have really are the utility companies, and more often than not, whenever we mention privatisation in Ireland, we usually talk about Aircom, and it's used as a kind of battering ram and a mallet to absolutely anybody who proposes privatisation. There's usually a load, including me, that come out and say, well, look what happened to Aircom, we can't repeat what happened to Aircom. But what happened with Aircom and the problems encountered by that sale, they're not a problem associated with privatisation itself per se. It was purely the method of the sale. They relinquishing the entire state ownership in one fell swoop, which was in complete stark contrast. We were the only EU country to do so with our national telecoms operator. Every other country either placed or floated partial stakes in each institution, retained some level of ownership over the companies, and then gradually reduced their ownership in those companies. Our problem was the government released its entire shareholding in the company, and it was therefore powerless to prevent any future undesirable changes in ownership, such as the private equity group getting their hands in it, sweating the assets, extracting cash, and really focusing on short-term goals rather than the long-term of such a strategic company. So in relation to our remaining strategic assets, if sales are being considered that they're at least partial and the government retains some kind of ownership, even the sales of partial stakes anyway can be governance enhancing in that they bring in maybe extra monitoring from other shareholders, etc. The other main one I want to talk about was the whole, in light of the country's indebtedness. That was one of that was explicitly stated in the terms of reference. And I suppose the key question is, can privatisation contribute to addressing the Irish fiscal crisis? Will it contribute to addressing the fiscal crisis by plugging a hole in the finances, by getting a couple of billion euro by selling different companies? And the main point here really is, well, what will be the net financial position of the Exchequer after any privatisation that occurs? And the most important variables in that respect are obviously the sale price and the direct and indirect expenses in relation to any potential sale. Myself and my colleague, we've done a good bit of research into the impact of privatisation on the Exchequer in Ireland, and we found that in almost all cases the privatisation proceeds were not maximised. So if your objective behind the privatisation is to actually raise revenue for the Exchequer in general, and in the international and in the national empirical evidence points to the fact that they're rarely maximised, and we actually found that the total revenue foregone or the costs associated with the 10 privatised companies to date actually accounted for over 25% of the gross proceeds raised. So there's lots of other factors that usually contribute to cost being lower. There might be discounts if you're floating shares, ESOPs, the employee share ownership programs, they've often led to a lot of revenue foregone to the Exchequer, etc. There can be significant foregone revenue to the Exchequer, and this shouldn't, privatisation should not be pursued with the sole objective of raising revenue for the Exchequer. It's rarely ever done. So, essentially what I'm trying to say is, I wouldn't be knocking, privatisation can be beneficial when done in the correct way and when the objectives behind the privatisation are clearly stated. But a simple farce of state-owned enterprises as a response to the fiscal crisis will be extremely ill-advised. Instead, any future decision in relation to privatisation should be taken in the context of a coherent and clearly articulated strategy for Ireland's entire public enterprise sector. And that strategy should consider all of the aspects in relation to it, deliver a clear statement of objectives for each enterprise. I mean, there is no national policy in relation to most of these enterprises, and it should really take into account both their economic and social functions. Obviously, any assessment of their performance should then actually take into account all of those different functions. And the main questions that should be considered in the formulation of such a strategy concern issues such as the governance of the sector, as well as issues in relation to the internationalisation of state-owned enterprise activities, the regulation of individual SOEs and their relevant sectors. And in that regard, I've just pointed to a few different points, but I mean, I think David touched on it there today. He mentioned the holding company, but serious consideration should be given to the type of holding company put forward by ICTU and even the OECD, where a specific agency is actually established to monitor and look after every state-owned enterprise, and it's one specific agency that's responsible for it. I think in France they have such an organisation, the APE, and a number of the Nordic countries also have agencies that are specifically responsible for their state-owned enterprise sector. And that doesn't preclude privatisation ever happening. Those companies then, those holding companies themselves would actually carry out any potential privatisations, and that's what they've been doing in France, where that agency itself is the agency responsible for bringing some of those companies to the market. The key Aircom experience really, I suppose, is just the retention of the network elements. So significant restructuring of a lot of those companies would have to take place prior to any sale. Complete separation of the networks and retention under public ownership. If there are to be any sales, they should be partial at first, just to establish market prices, etc., and then a gradual reduction in ownership. And also, I think, definitely avoiding any sale of a significant stake to private equity groups. The whole Aircom experience and in other countries has pointed to their short-term focus is completely at odds with the long-term focus that is required, especially in strategic industries which require long-term investment. So just to finish up, because I'm kind of talking, the other point I would have made is, besides the fact that it would be recommended to maybe have a holding company, I mean, Ireland's our existing stock of network assets could be far better utilised than they currently are. And in that regard, a specific network agency which would actually coordinate, I suppose, and monitor the investment activities in particular of all the state-owned networks related to roads, rail, electricity, gas, water, etc., and the telecoms assets that they all have, could be far better utilised. And indeed, the investment in all of those different networks could be more efficiently carried out if there was more coordination between these assets, and some kind of agency which oversees how the investment that takes place in those companies actually is carried out, etc., would be a very simple fix to actually improving the efficiency of those enterprises. So ultimately, just to finish up, I mean, the principal role of our state-owned enterprises, is obviously to ensure the efficient and the equitable provision of infrastructure and public services, and quality public services of that, and the fulfilment of that role is of critical importance to the competitiveness of our economy. I mean, we have followed the historical, in historical terms, there's always been an ebb and flow of the objectives of scopes of public enterprise. Some companies have gone into public enterprise, then back to private, then over and back from public to private, and we've been no different. We followed the European trend. We had a lot of public enterprises. We went through the period of commercialisation, deregulation and privatisation. Those measures brought a lot of benefits. A lot of maybe inefficient SOEs were woken up out of their slumber, if you want to call it that, and improved their efficiency and effectiveness. But privatisation has had some unintended consequences, especially in Ireland, including in underinvestment in vital infrastructure, the broadband infrastructure, is the obvious one I'm talking about there, and some negative distributional impacts. And important aspects such as competition policy and regulation require careful consideration when we plan any privatisation policy in the future. So the main recommendations on the basis of my research and Owen's research into Ireland's privatisation experience, and with similar international developments, are that state-owned enterprises should not be privatised for the principal purpose of raising exchequer revenues. Decisions in relation to the privatisation have to be made in the context of a comprehensive strategy for the overall state-owned enterprise sector, Selling partial stakes in state-owned enterprises in the first case should be considered. The network elements of all state-owned enterprises should remain under public ownership and possibly under a new network coordination agency. And the sale of stakes in state-owned enterprises to private equity groups should really be avoided at all costs. So that's
Very good.
very good.
Very good.
So really I want to talk about three different things. We start from the question of where will we stand if the world economy bounces back in 3 years' time, our wages have declined and so on. What kind of challenges would remain for us even then? Because I think there's crucial questions there. What elements do we have in the institutional framework right now that we can actually draw on, that we don't have to invent policy responses out of thin air? And thirdly, what are some of the general kind of ideas in response to this, the question posed in the program? What is the kind of public role that's involved in supporting private enterprise, and do we need an overarching industrial policy? So first, just looking at some statistics this week, kind of that's, well, if the world economy bounces back and so on, there's a market out there to be had. I think we still face, even in that more benign scenario, we still face very serious challenges that in many respects we faced at the end of the 1990s, and we haven't really, in some cases we've moved on, but in many cases not. So, for example, look at what's been happening in the labour market in the last couple of years. That is, unemployment in the labour market is, for all the talk about graduate unemployment, which is high, running around 20% among graduates in the last year, I think, that unemployment is heavily concentrated in people with less than university education. Now, males with less than a university degree are now running at 25 to 30% unemployed, according to the quarterly National Household Survey. And just looking at the kind of flow into unemployment and the flow into jobs from 2008 to 2009, which isn't published data, but you can get it in the micro data, there's a huge mismatch in terms of, obviously some companies are still hiring, and people with degrees and with certificates and diplomas are getting by far the lion's share of those jobs. So we're storing up a huge unemployment problem, which is closely linked to class, to some extent age, and certainly education. So the next 2 or 3 years are depending on policy, longer of high employment amount to massive disinvestment in that section of the society. In terms of capital, we have very little development and lending capacity within the banks. It's okay to talk about capital, but banks have never been lenders into the productive sector of the Irish economy. They didn't do it in the 1990s. When they did actually put capital in over the last 10 years, we know where they put it and what the problems were. It seems pretty clear that there's actually very little capacity within the banks as organisations to actually do that lending. And in fact, they've drawn on the expertise of Enterprise Ireland and appear to have in recent years to tap into that. The research sector, if we see the kind of cutbacks that we're looking at in the university sector, most likely we'll see that sustained kind of investment in targeted areas of research, but within a general context of lower resources going into the research side. And in terms of firms, the challenge I think will be that in many respects, actually I think the picture there is a little more mixed than people think, but certainly the challenges that we had in 2000 in terms of growing the indigenous sector, growing larger indigenous firms and so on, remain today. So I don't want to belabor those points, we can talk more about them, but just to say that simply a return to worldwide growth and wage competitiveness isn't necessarily going to deliver the kind of growth in the export sector that we might hope for. But having said that, I think there is, are important elements that we have within our institutional framework that we can build on. And here, my own work is around state agencies and enterprise policy, and I'll start with that, which is that a lot of the empirical work that's done on this, despite the kind of rhetoric of the significance of dead weight and the ineffectiveness of public supports and so on. The research that I've seen on manufacturing companies, systematic research on manufacturing companies and software services companies shows that government Enterprise Ireland grant aid policy is very effective in generating employment and exports. And in a sense, the question is not really, does that work? Which is, the question is, how do we build on that, on the lessons that we can learn on that, and on the knowledge within those agencies. I'll come to that in a second about the overarching industrial policy. And so I think there's a question there about how do we extend the enterprise policy and learn from it in terms of kind of tailoring to diverse models. In a sense, one of the problems with that Enterprise Ireland has had is taking a model that worked in terms of targeting product-oriented, export-oriented companies and applying to all sectors when, clearly the needs of indigenous manufacturing companies were different than those of animation companies and so on. Secondly, to kind of extend out the kind of lessons learned in fact, the public sector about lending and business development through financing into the private sector. And I'm picking up, I think it was Stephanie this morning talked about, we now own quite a chunk of the banking sector. And there's a difference between letting them off on their own, which, like I said, there's very little reason to expect that would generate productive lending into the productive sector. And the fear, I think a genuine fear that if government gets involved in the banks, that you'll have politicized lending. Well, there's something in the middle, which is a lending policy. Every bank has a lending policy. We just need to face up to the fact that we've had the wrong one. So, and whether it's private or public, you have a lending policy. So, the challenge there, and in essence, the state-prompted venture capital funds and the state development agencies have much better lending policies than the banks have had. There's no empirical reason why we shouldn't take those lessons into the private sector and avoid at the same time politicized lending. Then there's as I'm running on. All I say in terms of the training and education, obviously, is particularly worrying because of the whole FOSS situation and the R&D, is that there's quite a dangerous tendency there to target particular areas of research and particular areas of education and training, and that the kind of what that tends to do is focus the education and research systems on the needs of kind of large lead companies, usually around foreign investment, which is reasonable enough in its own terms, but it's kind of castles in the desert with very little, kind of what we need is a much more diverse set of supports around that. And there's a very good book by Richard Lester and Michael Piori from MIT a number of years ago, which is often used to argue that in public investment in research and so on doesn't generate rewards in terms of commercialization, which is fair enough, but the more important part of that argument is that the crucial contribution that can be made is by that universities and other education institutions represent public spaces where firms, customers, researchers and so on can learn from one another if those kind of opportunities are built into the system. So I think we're looking at much more kind of institutional forms for that. Finally, very quickly, what is the kind of overarching industrial policy here? In fact, I think the idea of an overarching industrial policy has in many ways been associated with a state that plans and picks winners and so on. And in fact, I think the role of the state is something quite different. And that role is to provide public supports for the kinds of activities that should be happening within the private sector. So that involves kind of making or supporting winners rather than necessarily picking them. It involves avoiding excessive targeting and at the same time being more responsive to the kinds of initiatives that happen when you see small subsectors growing. Having university systems and education systems that can be responsive to that. A lot of that information, and and I think the final part is, if we legitimate that, we open up better debates and kind of learning within the public agencies themselves. Because I find it depressing that you get a plan for jobs which is clearly based on targeting and so on. And when you know that many of the people within the agencies themselves have a much more subtle view of how their agencies work, what they can respond to, and what's happening within Irish industry. And in very fine-grained ways, you know, there are important differences that get obscured. For example, you have the games industry, which is based on localizing games for the European market. You have the animation industry, which is enormously successful in terms of local innovative companies. The two get completely obscured in these kind of broad, high-level strategies. And it's that kind of subtle responsiveness that we need to build into industrial policy.
Thank you, Sean.
Thank you very much. And Bernadette Andreas O'Callaghan, actually, and French national from ancestors from northern Italy. Actually, I've been in Ireland for 2 decades and something. No, I forgot exactly. But anyway, so I work at the University of Limerick with Donald, and I'm not an expert on the Irish economy. What I've been doing over the last two decades and something has been looking at the Irish economy through the prism of Europe, if you want, and the outside world. So it's very much European integration, I feel. But anyway, I try to bring some ideas here. And what I wanted to do was to follow on what John has been saying about industrial policy. It seems, and use, also what I want to do is use the experience of industrial policy of other economies since the crisis has started. I know our colleague from Norway this morning said, well, everybody wants to look at the Scandinavian countries as a model, but we are not really a model, but still been thinking about industrial development and capitalist models for the last 2-3 decades. And I always come back to the Scandinavian model and perhaps the Japanese and Korean models, which do show something which is, in my view, in my eyes, more advanced than what other economies would have suggested so far. So I will try to use these economies to shed some light on the Irish situation. Then what I want to do is to look at the sources of growth in Ireland over the past few years and see where problems are, and finally propose some insights into what could be done in terms of industrial development, if you want, putting the emphasis on private firms, since Donald has been talking about the public sector, public enterprises. Right, it's strange, but in Europe the industrial policy is something that was very much discarded during the period of economic growth up to 2 years ago, right? We tried to avoid talking about industrial policy. It was one of these nasty words because it sounds too interventionist, right? It sounds too left-wing, it sounds too Marxist maybe. In Ireland, I found that through the agencies here, RDA and Channel Development, myself and Farzan, there's more pragmatism about industrial policy. People do it, right? There's less ideology. And there's a lot of interventionism, if I could use this word in Ireland over the last few decades. And suddenly it seems to me that things have stopped in Ireland, whereas industrial policy has come back in other countries in Europe, right? So it's really, again, here the Irish case is very unique in that it's going in a different direction to that of other countries. So I've distributed this little page, 2 pages here. And the first table is quite interesting because it shows that there has been in a select group of countries, and I put also Austria. It's not a Scandinavian country, but it's a small European economy, small enough, let's say. And I've taken the case of Denmark, Finland and Sweden compared with Ireland. And we've seen that in the last couple of years, 2009 and 10, there has been a number of stimulus measures taken by these governments in those countries, right? And these fiscal stimulus programs or projects targeted essentially industries. For example, they would have taken the form of giving people the ability to buy new cars, for example, trading of old cars for new cars, and that's something that we built in countries such as Sweden, which has a very strong car manufacturing industry, for example. So here it's interesting to note that these measures have been relatively important in terms of GDP for 2009 and 2010 in countries such as Austria, but also Finland, Sweden, and less so in Denmark. And we see that Ireland is lagging behind, right? And the first column shows the increase in public investment here. So there has been an increase in public investment as a response to the crisis. All these stimulus packages here were approved by national governments. Ireland, zero, and there was nothing much in this area. Right, we know that these measures are enshrined into this broad framework, which is the European Economic Recovery Plan endorsed in December 2008. So there is so much we can do. We have relinquished our ability to design monetary policy, but also in terms of industrial policy, of course, it's very much something which is designed at European level. So the European Council of Ministers in December 2008 came up with this idea that we should inject 200 billion euros, about 1.5% of GDP, but most of it here, most of this injection of funds comes from the national governments, right? It's the part which is earmarked through EU funding is quite minuscule, actually. And the idea being, it's a Keynesian idea, right? We boost demand, and people will eventually, if you boost demand in France and Germany and TASC, give the ability of people to buy new cars, that will have a positive impact on the car sectors in those countries, and this is actually what has happened. And calculations have been done on the positive impact of these measures. The problem is that they are short-term, obviously, right? They don't last unless you re-inject funds. The Stability and Growth Pact has been mentioned this morning in several instances, and indeed here it's not dead because the right 3% GDP 3% deficit to GDP ratio objective by 2014 is something which is driven by the Stability and Growth Pact, unfortunately. There is so much countries can do because they have to, of course, injecting funds into the economy might lead to higher budget deficits if it's done in certain ways, right? And this goes against this stability, objective of stability, which was the overarching objective of the ECB. Right, it seems therefore that there is a big difference between what Ireland has been doing since the beginning of the crisis and what other countries, small open economies, have been doing on the other hand, right? And this is Scandinavian countries and Austria as well. There seems to be something like an Irish exception here, and this might be because, and this has been mentioned this morning, the country has opted or has been asked to opt for a certain type of industrial policy, which is very confined, state aids to the banking sector, nothing else, right? Actually, when we pump money into the banking sector, these are state aids, and state aids, as we know, were totally condemned, or we were trying to get rid of state aids in the European Union, right? But now they are tolerated because we need to restructure the banking sector. So just the Irish government has done one thing, and that's it. Didn't leave too much space to all-encompassing industrial policy. Does it make sense if we look at the sources of output growth or GDP growth in Ireland? Right, this little second page here, this little table, maybe it's a bit instructive. These are relative figures, right, and it shows that. Actually, relative figures, that means I've taken the components of GDP and tried to give the ratio of each component vis-à-vis GDP. And the main, let's say, the most obvious observation of which emanates from this table is the fact that the investment to GDP ratio has nearly halved over the period to 2006 to 2009. 27% in 2006, 15% 15% last year, right? So this is the dramatic news, if we want, right? Investment has been quite sluggish, and this is where our problems are. And of course, GDP has been decreasing, but still in relative terms, the other components have been decreasing as well, but in relative terms, investment has been decreasing much more than the rest, which, again, the problem of arithmetics makes other, if you want, components of GDP increase slightly. For example, net exports, right? That has, yeah, exports, net exports, that means exports minus imports. Yes, there have been exports and imports have been decreasing in the last 2 years, but exports have been decreasing less than imports. So there's been a kind of indeed here, this has been quite reported in the newspaper. There has been a kind of a recovery of small recovery of exports, not enough indeed to create to have an impact on growth. Because what we see, the second observation that emanates from this table, what we see is that personal consumption is actually a major component of growth, right? And this has been highlighted this morning. I'm just repeating what has been said, but it's totally illogical to think that we can get our way out of the recession through the crisis, through exports, because everybody thinks the same. And actually, to make the picture worse, the Chinese are now saying, well, export-led growth, it's not for us anymore, it's for developing countries. We're not a developing country anymore. We have a potentially very strong domestic economy, so we are going to grow internally. And the Chinese government today is putting forward policies which are promoting actually the domestic consumption as opposed to foreign consumption, i.e. exports. So here there's a lot all these small figures here, which are simple enough, right, show one thing, which is that if we want policies and industrial policies, well, if we were serious about industrial policy in Ireland, we should think about growing demand, domestic demand, through, well, thanks to supply side measures, supply side that would be beneficial to Irish firms, right? And this is my next point. What should we do, right? Yes, in 3 minutes. What should we do in order to have a fully fledged industrial policy? First of all, to find an optimal level of arbitrage between fiscal consolidation. We all agree that it's necessary, but it's not a panacea, and growth-led measures, right? That means putting more emphasis on industrial policy. We need to target more the manufacturing and other sectors as opposed to the banking sector. This is what the Nordic countries have been doing. Or you will object, you will say, oh, by the way, they didn't have a banking problem as much as we do. True, but they went through a banking crisis in 1990. Again, not to the same magnitude as ours, but they did also use a number of measures, and in particular, trying to improve the competitiveness of their economies, or trying to improve the manufacturing base of their economies. There are a number of ways, let's say, fiscal policies, and again towards the manufacturing sectors that we could put in place, expenditures in the area of the communication infrastructure. This has been mentioned, a well-functioning educational system. This is crucial. And even recently, some of these Scandinavian economies have cut expenditure, but certainly not in education and not in research, innovation. This is paramount for growth. We still believe in the smart economy. Other measures, apart from efficiency in the public sector, there might be some scope there, yes, but other measures are about reducing taxes that penalize productive activity, labor and company. I don't think the labor corporation tax rate will be below 12.5% here, but certainly to raise it might harm the manufacturing sector at this moment in time, should have been done before. And raising taxes on real estate, on speculative activities, I know that TASC has proposed here some measures from the fiscal angle. We could also think about the government support for the renovation of housing, of building. These are all projects that could be targeted and could help the local artisans, local manufacturing firms. I know there's still a lot to do this, and this could be green type of projects. And a policy which to me is part of industrial policy, which is part an idea which is crucial, is to try to focus now the attention towards the indigenous sector. Again, this has been said and again, but we need really to think seriously about the indigenous firms, which normally are SMEs, and stop putting all our eggs into these foreign manufacturing firms, which, as we know, are footloose, are here today and will tomorrow. So thank you for your attention.
I'd like to thank the three speakers for three very interesting presentations. I think they've opened up a lot of points that we can consider. However, in this session we have limited time left, about 10 or 12 minutes before we have to wrap up. So I'd like to point you to the timetable here. At the end session this afternoon there will be a question and answer session where we can deal with all the general topics. So I'd like to keep the few minutes that we have left here specific on the topics that we're talking about here, specific issues and solutions. And what we're talking about is the state sector and the part of the state that supports private enterprise. Is what specific measures could be promoted that would foster economic development and create jobs. So what I'd like to do for the few minutes we have left is, in tandem with what has been proposed from the speakers here, are there any other suggestions on how this might be done, or any kind of variations or additions to what the speakers put forward?
Where the public sector or the taxpayer is responsible for giving resources and money to the private sector, what do you think about the idea of empowering workforces and trade unions and civil society to monitor that investment? Because you spoke about political investment being almost a bad thing and politicising the investment, but there are other ways of, I would say, politicising these things by empowering the workforce to make sure that resources from the state are looked after in an open and accountable way, and you would be reviving the whole idea of industrial democracy and giving the trade unions a much more positive role, not just looking after money wages, but actually looking after creating production.
Very good.
Yeah, on the question of, a couple of questions. One, is there a role for an agency, a state enterprise agency, and would it be politically acceptable that would actually seek out opportunities in the market which are not being met by private enterprise and actually fill those needs in a way that wouldn't be regarded as in some way derogated from the rights of private entrepreneurs? And secondly, in terms of industrial policy, it would seem that the foreign direct investment is kind of a given in the sense that there's a well-worked model there which more or less any government is going to follow, and it's it would have very kind of limited potential over the long term. And there is an element of instability in that they may pull out at a moment's notice if they're doing a global reorganisation or whatever. So obviously the SME and the indigenous sector is very important. Is there scope for some kind of dramatic increase in the performance of the indigenous sector by a range of measures? One that comes to mind is in terms of the government's impact on the indigenous sector. You hear a lot from small businessmen about the impact of both costs, like what are being called stout taxes, where the government is using fees, etc., for services it provides as a way of raising revenue instead of reducing the cost of the business. Also, bureaucratic, light touch regulation has a bad name in terms of the banking industry, but there does seem to be a case that there's heavy bureaucratic regulation in terms of form filling, etc., in many parts of private industry. And had a number of other ones, but I forgot them, so I'll let you know.
Okay, I think we're getting very good suggestions here. In the TASC system, these will be fed in terms of to consolidate things together and to develop economic policy around that and working through the economist networks and other networks. So,
Thanks, Michael. And just to say that the question raised by Congress on the state, holding company state, one of the proposals we made in our submission to the McCarthy group was the idea of looking at it in sectors. So, for example, there's the infrastructure section of energy. So the strategic linking of ESB on board Gash, board Mona, all of which are involved in the energy. And only what they're doing in the present area, I mean, the whole issue then of what we're doing or not doing with our oil and gas as an enterprise. The issue of, for example, Bord Mona and Quecha own between them 10% of the land, land resources of the country. How that can best be utilised to create jobs, and not only in the traditional areas of timber and turf, which are again fluctuating, but even like the whole area of tourism. That there's different areas that we can go down, and the fact that we are an island country, the part of the thing of public. I know that's commercial companies, but at the same time, how we import and export to our ports is very, very important. And we don't want a situation necessarily where ports are being sold off because the land is more valuable than the trade that goes through it. I mean, it may be more valuable to the company that owns it, but it may not be more valuable for the state. And from memory, there's been some controversy there as to what happens and what doesn't happen. So I think it has to be a strategic thinking. Like the idea of, rather than companies being in competition with each other and fighting with this and that as a country we have to have strategic thinking. And just the last point, I think the whole distortion that was done on the economy by the building bubble, and the fact that unemployment, that thousands of young men were pulled out of the education system, they went into the buildings. We had a quarter of all the men in the country who were working 3 years ago, were working in the building industry. We were supposed to be building a smart economy. That was just Wild West economics. But a huge number of those people don't have skills. They were unskilled, semi-skilled operatives, and now they neither have a job nor an education, and without an enterprise policy, the high-tech industry policy is all fine and well, but somebody who left school at 15 spent 3 years behind a shovel of a big mixer. So we have to have some policy either to reskill those people or to provide industry for which those people's skills are appropriate. And I think that's one of the big tasks which we have to do.
Okay. Ties in with Sean's point on the base of the investment in education and training.
Yeah, just very briefly, the importance of indigenous industry as a potential exporter needs to be looked at as well. And there may be sectors such as trade and international education services, where, for example, we have a comparative advantage in many areas, including the fact that we're English speaking and so on.
Yeah.
No one knows quite the size of that sector and activity. It's at least €1 billion, but it's probably much larger. It doesn't appear on its own in the balance of payments data from the CSO. Other areas, possibly construction, where the bottom has fallen out, but maybe there are areas in which indigenous enterprises could target markets abroad I'm thinking also the voluntary work of people like Niall Mellon and others. Because a lot of the people who have survived or hung on until now have focused on very local markets, just odd jobs in the locality and so on. But there may be other niches on the international side. Just to answer the question about public-private cooperation, it may be that there are ways in which, in partnership, some of the capacity for lending through the state, well, let's call it the state banking system, the state-owned banking system in many cases. There may be ways in which, industrial lending for indigenous exporting activities that I mentioned as well, could actually be specifically dealt with and separated off from retail banking, and that's kind of getting into the strategic investment concept as well. So, there's a lot of potential purchase there in terms of growing out of the recession. I think it's necessary to have supply side issues identified and to be specific, because otherwise it's just not going to happen automatically. There has to be a new way of actually identifying these possibilities.
Thank you.
Yeah, just a couple of ideas to throw out, apart from the basic one of extending the current traditional model of public enterprise into other areas, such as Fine Gael's proposed public enterprise next generation broadband network company. But the first one being, is there a possibility of rethinking the public enterprise model in more diverse ways than just the traditional, the minister owns the share? In other words, that the public enterprise model can also begin to incorporate, other equity from workers, from local management, from other stakeholders. There are 3 examples. Waterford Glass. There was interest from local management, workers, local authorities, and even native investors to save a worldwide brand. The state could have come in, bought it for a song of the examiner or the receiver, and could have enabled, if we had a new kind of model for that, enabled that to stay. Same thing with SR Technics, that also had, a management, a local management buy-in. The state could have also been involved in that, or indeed in the case of Capican Chickens, a very important regional enterprise. The new owners came in and put a gun to the workers' heads and said, you either work for minimum wage or we walk. To actually enable other interests to get involved and not just rely on private capital. So can we, something that does reflect the diversity of the economy and the diversity of interests that goes beyond just state and private capital. The second thing, the second proposal is it time that we dusted off, reread, reworked, and retooled for modern times the TASC report? I don't want to get into this whole thing about, picking winners and all that, but let's be clear. That's exactly what the Enterprise Ireland does through, in another way, by saying, if you succeed at these things, we will give you support. So we have a capability, we have an infrastructure that can be based on a sectoral basis, whereby it's not just supporting successful companies, but supporting successful formulas that are democratically constructed by the stakeholders at a sectoral level. And it's a perfect opportunity to expand social partnership and other interests in that. I mean, dare I say, is there a role for democracy in building an indigenous enterprise sector?
Just 2 quick suggestions. On the education side of things and the unskilled and semi-skilled, and young people make up the majority of the unemployed, I think that maybe the university sector and college sector could come together with a view to online learning crossover programs to get people re-educated or back into education on mobile phone applications and so on. This is a developing field that there could be some investment in the education department in. A second suggestion then is just for innovation centres. So that you could look at the IT sector and the smart economy and so on, but if you look in depth at those, it's almost mining for information, so that there's a huge amount of varying level skilled work that could be done by public-private investment, and basically this is a guaranteed return on investment. It is like I said just after, it's like having gold under the ground and sending all the unemployed people to dig for it, and it's very easy to get them to dig for gold and to pay them a wage. I would think you could set up innovation centres with your network coordination applications, driving the broadband and so on, and you could, in theory, in a quick enough period of time, you could actually give people that are unemployed the option of working in these almost, as a replacement of social welfare.
Okay. How many more contributors have we? 4. Okay.
I just think that the web allows relatively small companies to develop their business and network in a way they couldn't have done a couple of years ago. One of the obvious things strikes me is there's relatively little, if you operate purely with sort of the EU context of marketing Ireland as a brand. You know what I mean? Like I always thought last short while that Guinness campaign was absolutely superb in terms of marketing Guinness as a global brand. I often think that there isn't, there's too much emphasis about we're all European now, right? As a single, actually we're all Irish. I think there's a need and a change of mindset in terms of marketing Ireland, trying to develop us as a country and a distinct separate country that has this use of the web to market our products.
Thank you.
I was interested in the comments about the fact that we had industrial policy was still a respected activity in Ireland, and I suspect that that has probably something to do with purpose, and I'm surprised that purpose, its role wasn't referred to. And I'm just wondering if rather than suggest new agencies, and there's always a problem about setting up new agencies, particularly at this point in time, but could purpose become the body that would look across the state enterprises in relation to their investment policies and try and coordinate that, and have they some greater role to play, and maybe more transparent role to play in monitoring and overseeing our public sector bodies?
Should the state have a role in supporting the development of not-for-profit services? I'm thinking in terms of, the provision of health and social care services now, because we're seeing a lot of foreign agencies coming in here and setting up. Is that a possible model?
Yeah, I think that's something we can look at as well. Thank you.
Yeah, just a few points. On the question of the labour market, somebody over here referred to all the men who kind of were sucked out of the education system and went into the construction industry. If we're not to kind of almost lose a generation of young people, should the state be actively targeting these to get them back into whatever diploma, certificate courses that will give them a step up in the labour market? And do we have the knowledge, in fact, to even target what areas we should encourage these to go into? That's one. The other, on the question of retaining skills in the country, probably many people are aware that the Labour Party has a policy of internship, where people would be encouraged, and companies would be encouraged to set up systems for interns to come in and work, possibly just maybe paid expenses or whatever, but they would be developing their skills, they would be retaining the skills within the country, they would be contributing to the development of the country, and they would be there waiting when the upturn comes. A gentleman over here had a very interesting concept of the stakeholders investing in an enterprise. Like the concept of what a stakeholder is has broadened enormously in the last 20 years. It used to be the shareholders, basically, and maybe the workers. Whereas now the suppliers, the customers, the local community are all regarded as stakeholders in the business. And it would seem that there could be a great scope for development of a model nationally with the encouragement of the state into this type of investment. The other point is, how important is inflation as a factor in our development? I know personally I was shocked to see the level of inflation in this country over the last 15 years. I know we have virtual deflation at the moment. That has its own problems. But and if we see inflation as an important factor, how extreme are we prepared to go to control? Like in the 60s, both in this country and the UK, they went to great extremes. They had prices and incomes policy, whereby prices and incomes were actually regulated by the state. But would there be a case for that in the short term as an emergency measure, maybe for a year or 2 years, and would it be politically acceptable? Okay, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Just make one point on the regional dimension of the crisis. Given that we have a national crisis, it's kind of easy to forget the regional aspects to it. And provincial Ireland, rural Ireland, over the last while, is, particularly in terms of employment, has been very dependent on the construction industry and on the public sector as well. You think of provincial towns around Ireland outside the kind of commuter belt. Both of those, obviously the construction industry has collapsed, and public employment in public services is obviously going to be under pressure and going to decline. So I think we have to look at that, because if those communities are allowed to decline, if the age cohorts 15 to 30 leave, those communities aren't easily regenerated. So it's not just a question of the next 3 years of a crisis or the next 5 years. If we don't address those issues, rural Ireland dies on its feet for all time.
Thank you. Okay, that's very last one, so.
Yeah, no, just, I mean, total employment in the Irish economy is about 1.8 million. And those employed by state-assisted companies, IDA, Enterprise Ireland, is about 272,000, which is about 14.4% of total employment. Of that figure, it's about 139,000, which is directly employed by, say, the multinational sector, which is 7% of total employment. And that's where really we're hedging our bets in terms of the smart economy. Now, if we're hedging our bets in terms of the smart economy and job creation, it's now 7% of total employment. To me, it seems quite fanciful to think that this is going to be where we're going to generate the next 500, 800,000 jobs. It's just physically not possible. And I think what's often overlooked in the Irish case is that, you know, we had jobless growth in the early 90s, so really full employment only occurred with the emergence of the construction boom. So that begs the question, though, did we need that construction boom to create full employment in the Irish case? So that gets back to your point, John, that this underlying structural level of unemployment that we never tackled. And I just don't see your electrician, your builder who's lost a job going on to train to be a pharmaceutical engineer to get employed in this 7% of the economy. So I think to a certain extent both progressives and conservatives tend to overlook the extent of this problem. I genuinely don't see where those jobs are going to come from.
Okay, all right folks, we had some very, very interesting suggestions here.